Good morning, everybody. This is Geraint Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Major Ports Group. Thank you all for joining. What will hopefully be a very interesting seminar on looking at the opportunities and challenges around port decarbonisation. We're calling the webinar Improving Port Sustainability, the Strategies and Next Steps to Deliver Decarbonisation and Reducing Emissions at Ports. And this is a UK focus, but obviously we're looking at international best practice from around the world as well. So on that basis, I'm delighted that as well as me chairing and comparing this session, and for those who don't know me, like I said, my name is Geraint Evans and I'm the Chief Exec of the UK Major Ports Group. The UK Major Ports Group is trade association membership body of the UK's 9 largest port owning groups. I won't list them all for you now, but Maxine and the team will circulate the map, and I'm sure you should all know those major ports. And I'm delighted to A, host this session with colleagues from across the sector, and B, welcome Richard Willis and Jake Rigby, who are going to talk to us about some of the projects that they've been working on over the last couple of years, what's going to be happening in 2026, sort of challenges and opportunities, like I said. So what I was going to do is just briefly touch on what we're going to cover off today, which we'll come back to in a second. But in the meantime, I'll just introduce our speakers. So Richard Willis, again, who's the Technical Director of Port Operations Technology for Asconing. And Richard has got over 30 years of experience in port operations, technology and consulting, and leads the global ports decarbonisation team at Asconing, and is based in the Netherlands for today, as well as working internationally across Europe and the wider world. Richard leads on projects that improve efficiency and productivity in ports and terminals, and helping those operators sort of deliver on plans and execute plans and formulate plans, both working with public and private authorities. So we're looking forward to hear from Richard this morning. So he's going to take us through a few slides. And also Jake is going to take us through some slides too. Jake is the global head of innovation and research at BMT. And originally trained as a naval architect, working as a senior and principal naval architect before his transition to research management. Jake is a passionate futurologist and a member of the World Future Society, and has also been named an honorary professor at the University of Exeter in recognition for his work leading in industry and academic collaboration. So a great couple of speakers this morning. Delighted to have you with us this morning, Richard and Jake. So given coming into 2026, I think we're all coming into the year with lots of hopes and dreams, and think about how we continue on this journey into the sort of energy transition and decarbonisation journey. So we'll come back around on some of the challenges later on. But perhaps, Richard, if I hand over to you, and you can perhaps kick us off with some initial thoughts, and then I'll leave it to you to take us through the slides.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. We'll have a look at my slides in a minute. Okay, I want to talk about decarbonisation for ports, but as a challenge for the community around ports, not just a challenge for the individual businesses, which it is, of course, but how do we work together to try and solve this problem a bit better? Next slide. So, I mean, why do we care about this? Of course, there is the policy direction, which we kind of know. We know there's the Maritime 2050, the Clean Maritime Plan. There's all the objectives for the IMO. But increasingly, as we work with ports, we see that this is the background music, of course. But why they really didn't want to look at decarbonisation is for some of these other reasons. They're being pressured by their clients, by the cargo owners, shipping lines, to show that they're doing something about this challenge. Therefore, they need better data, better transparency for their reporting, understanding their footprint, understanding what they're going to do. Some clients, less so in the UK, but in other places, are really interested in trying to get lower cost finance from investors. And of course, when we talk about decarbonisation, we also talk about being more efficient, which is also brings a focus on reducing operating costs too. But in the port, of course, all the different tenants, the port users, the clients, we're all kind of struggling with this same challenge. That's why it's a community challenge, and we can work better together. Next slide, please, Martin. Thanks. So this image here is a typical greenhouse gas footprint. It's from a project we did in South America. It's not a UK port, but whenever you do a carbon footprint for a port, you end up with a pie chart, something like this. And I think it's important to understand as a port authority, a port operator perhaps, where you can really control it. And that's really when talking about scope 1 and 2, basically the diesel and electricity we use to run our port, is to summarize. You can control that and you can focus on that, and you should. And then there's the tenants and users around you, which also have that same challenge. You can support them, but as you can see on the pie chart, when we talk about the port as a whole, most of the emissions come from scope 3, which are the ships and trucks and that visit the port. The port can't really control those. National policy can control them, but only to some degree. So that's trying to exercise some influence and trying to support with infrastructure to try and support that same challenge that shipping lines and trucking companies are after. We'll come back to scope 3 a little bit later. Next slide, please. So we try and simplify this story of decarbonisation pathways into 3 main segments: reducing, being more efficient, saving, replacing, upgrading to new technologies, and renewables. How can we use our port to generate energy? So thinking the first one, reducing, I'm going to show you a few pictures and examples of projects we did during 2025. Most of those are outside the UK, but perfectly common challenges for inside the UK too. Saving fuel and power using telemetry and technology. This one is from a project we did in Jordan, working with the towage operator, that by using telemetry, understanding how their crews work, understanding better ways of using engines, they've saved over 20% of the fuel bill for towage, which was about a quarter of the diesel usage for the whole of the port community. And that applies to landside equipment and everything as well. Relatively easy, relatively cheap investment, but big returns to be had. Next one. Replacing. Often we talk about replacing old diesel equipment with new electric equipment. This picture here is from a client of ours in Colombia, is replacing 25 of their diesel RTGs with electric ones. And of course, substantial air quality and carbon gains for that. In the UK, we see a lot of clients taking the slightly easier route, which is replacing diesel itself with the drop-in fuel of HVO, very popular in UK ports. You can claim up to 90% carbon reduction for that. That possibly may be a short-term approach. We're starting to see the risk of HVO. Is it going to be as reliable as it has been? Is it going to be as cheap as it has been? Is there competition from aviation? So it's definitely a challenge. But moving to fully electric, also a big challenge for UK ports, getting those HV grid connections and the power into ports, which, by the way, was exactly the same for our client in Colombia. Next one. And the renewables, this is a UK port. It's my home port of Liverpool. So whenever I do a presentation, there's always something about Liverpool in it. This is Peel Ports, and they're, I think, the largest roof-mounted solar array in the UK in partnership with E.ON, going to generate up to 30 megawatts of power from solar in rainy and cloudy Liverpool. Great example of an asset that's in a port, doesn't really have any use apart from keeping the rain off. How can we use the assets in the port to generate power, which improves our decarbonisation position? Pretty much every port we look at has some form of being able to do solar, wind, or hydro, or some other way of generating power. Just as an example, the one I mentioned in Jordan we did, they have 10 hectares of trade car parking for import cars, and Jordan's really sunny. So if they were to cover that in a solar canopy, they would generate more power than the port uses in a year. So there's really lots of opportunities in this area. Next one. I think we start to talk about all these initiatives like we mentioned on the first slides, and there are dozens of them you can do. It's important to start to piece together a plan about how you're going to do that and think about the investment planning. These graphs are from a different project in South America. You can see the carbon trajectory coming down, scope 1 and 2, as we implement. There was 25 different projects in this one. And then you can see how the CapEx planning comes into that. You can see the spikes of CapEx at the top of the graph, which is investment in new equipment, basically. But that also changes your OpEx model, becoming more efficient, moving to electricity, which is a different price profile. So bringing that all together is really important for ports to understand what does it mean to a business. Ports generally won't go for decarbonisation just because it's a good thing. They will go for it if they're either made to do it by regulation, which is a bit soft at the moment, or it makes good business sense, and they need to see that is there a return on investment to be had. Next slide. To go back to the community topic, this is a picture from Port of Rotterdam, down the road from where I am today. All the different colours show different tenants and operators in the port. So all these different shapes and colours, they all have the same challenge. They have different businesses, but the challenge is the same: electrification, equipment, efficiency. So trying to work together as a port community is really important. We can share lessons about tech or new tools, whatever. We can even share people as well. There are some skills required in carbon footprinting and running programs to improve. But I think really interesting, if we adopt a cluster approach, you can improve your commercial value and competitive positioning as a port as a whole. Talk about tugboats, talk about terminal operators. You bring all these things together for a attractive proposition for the port, which I think is important from a UK context as well. And next slide, I think this is the last one. Back to scope 3, of course. So once we've worked on scope 1 and 2, which are difficult enough, then we have the larger challenges of scope 3. Shore power for vessels, of course, we know across the channel in Europe, pressure from the EU to provide shore power for vessels by 2030. Very ambitious. And you see projects like in the picture, Rotterdam Shore Power, where public authorities are investing over 250 million euros in shore power in Port of Rotterdam. Those expectations will spread to the UK for sure. They already are. Those shipping lines will want to be able to plug in the UK as well. How do we deal with that? New marine fuels, shipping lines, beyond LNG, which is some people would say is a transition fuel. We're talking about hydrogen, we're talking methanol, we're talking about ammonia. What does that mean for UK ports, bunkering? How do we supply that? A whole collection of interesting challenges there. And on the land side, electric trucks are coming. Some of them are already here in the UK. Does this create an interesting new challenge or opportunity for ports to provide charging? But we're back to this story of electricity again. So I think these are some interesting challenges for 2026. And that's it from me for now, but I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Richard, thank you very much, and really interesting set of slides. And I think that they all highlight some of the, again, opportunity challenges that come with that. Just given some of the topics, I'll come back on a couple of thoughts in a second, but bespoke versus sort of boilerplate versus public and private, just how do you see the maturity in some of these projects? Because in my experience in the UK, it's almost never boilerplate. It's almost always bespoke, and there's often a misconception in the port sector that every port, well, you can lift this from here to here, but our ports are very different. And of course, we're in a private construct in the UK. Tell me about where your thinking is on some of that.
I think some of the strategies for decarbonising, I mean, we did 4 or 5 projects over the last year, and the same themes came out in every time in different continents. So there is some learning to be had. We are talking about electrification. The big global terminal operators are pushing for that. They recognise that this is the way. So electrification of equipment is indeed the thing. So there is copy and paste lessons. Every port believes they operate on an island that are completely unique and completely special. That's only half true, in my opinion. There are things that can be shared, and that's why this community approach is really good. And there's some nice alliances of equipment manufacturers and terminal operators working together to do standardization of equipment. For example, the ZEPA Alliance, they're a really good example of working together. I think the point you made about the ownership and therefore the funding, I think that's the critical factor. In Rotterdam, down the road from where I am, basically all public money, more or less. So it's relatively easy for the power company and the port operator and the council all to work together and fund what they need to do, because it's for the greater good. It's much more complicated where you have a landlord which maybe has no operating influence. They've concessioned out all of their terminals. How does the landlord, which is usually a public body of some kind, how do they convince the private operators to do that? Through concession agreements is one, but they only come up every 10, 25 years. And if you were doing a new concession now, you'd certainly want to put these targets in. And in the UK, of course, you have trust ports, which again, more complicated again, but the trust port should be in a stronger position because the benefits of decarbonisation also benefit the city residents, the air quality, the traffic, those other things that trust ports that are involved with a local authority, say Portsmouth, have a much more blended benefit for doing it. One of the challenges is if you have a purely private operator, which there are several in the UK, searching for that true return on investment business case for decarbonisation can be really weak. So that's a challenge for us, is trying to move forward this story, but it also to be investable and commercially successful.
Yeah, and on the commercial side of things, as you say, where on the largely privately owned ports, there's a longer time frame in terms of that return on investment. But
Yeah.
how we make it attractive and investable when we're going back to our boards, etc., and our investors, etc., is the critical point there. Tell me about your thoughts on. You touched on Jordan there as one example, but intermittency of power and intermittency in the power when we need it, because there are examples where a solar project, for example, I don't mean on roofs, but a solar project to support efforts on the quay, works without storage, but then you only get the power when you need it, or when it's there rather. But then if you add in storage, it becomes a very different proposition and quite a difficult business case. And I think for many of our ports, and I'm not speaking for all of our ports here, but for many of us, we don't need all that power at a minute's notice, 24/7. So tell me about how do you think this matures and starts to develop? Because I think intermittency is interesting, and whether the storage element, the battery storage element of some of these transition fuels is probably the more interesting part of what comes next.
Yes. I wish I knew the perfect answer to that question. I think
there is to challenge ourselves, because I think that's the bit that's interesting here, because I think there's some
exactly. Yeah,
Jake, do come in if you've got thoughts as well, Jake.
Yeah, port operators are looking at batteries, and it's definitely something there, right? The technology is improving, the cost is coming down. Running a larger amount of solar during the day is great, but then at nighttime you need to operate and you need the power.
Yeah.
Is it realistic to charge the whole thing with batteries? No, probably not, but it can help with peak load shaving, right? So you're taking your power from the grid, and when your cranes are operating, you're creating peaks, and the batteries can skim off some of that peak loading. So that kind of puzzle can allow you to operate a bit more aggressively, but without too much extra HV connection. So
Jake, do you want to come in on that point, Jake?
Yeah, sure. And I'll go into a bit more detail in my slides around kind of ports as an energy hub. But I think you're seeing a concurrent trend of cold ironing becoming more popular, with ships wanting to plug into power supplies once they're alongside. And if we had a unlimited grids connection and grid supply, then that wouldn't be a problem. But that's not the case. So as that continues to evolve, we need to think about different ways. Batteries are great because quite often we're getting in energy in terms of electricity, and we want to expel it as electricity. But even on land and even in ports, we still are constrained by that energy density and the economics of it. So just like Richard, I wish I had the perfect answer to it. I think there's a lot of challenges still to overcome. I equally don't think it's going to be one single solution. I think there's going to be multiple different solutions depending on where you are, what resources you have available, what connectivity you've got. So it's an exciting place to be, and leads back onto your previous comment around are we talking about bespoke solutions or things that we can carry between? I'd hope that there are elements that are common that we can learn from each other and bring out through great forums like this. But by the very nature of ports, they're always in a different place and a different constraints. So there's always got to be something that's bespoke.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and we'll come back to that in your slides as well in a moment or two, Jake. Richard, just tell us about the project in Liverpool. Tell us about the lessons from that.
Well, I think it's quite straightforward to have a port. You've got lots of roof space. You can fill it with solar panels. That's great. But then we immediately hit upon this issue of producing a large amount of power when it's sunny and no power when it's dark. Obviously, what do you do with that power? How do you distribute it in the port? Or even more kind of challengingly, you want to export it to the grid that buffers that power supply. And actually, this is the same as you want to bring power into the port. You want to export a large amount of power from your port the substations and structures, the infrastructure is not there to really support that. So ports, the same in the one I mentioned in Jordan too. How can we use that power inside our port and integrate it to our grid, and use it to charge our reefers during the day, for example? But that grid integration within the old power network in the port is a challenge. Peel ports will tell you the same, I'm sure, and it's a challenge everywhere. So adding loads of solar and it magically solving the solution is not always quite so simple.
And it is a challenge, and I think that we've been doing a lot of work with National Grid and NESO and the DNOs over the last few years, and I think that they've come on a bit of a journey actually in terms of understanding hopes and dreams at ports, which I think is we're on that journey now, but I think there's still quite a way to go actually. Tell me about, and Jake, come in on this as well before we come over to you, but the sort of in many of these scenarios, as we look at these case studies and projects, this number of calls, this vessel comes at this time. Often in a port, as you know, it's a bit more dynamic. That vessel will kind of call when it calls, and we'll sometimes it's like London buses. So tell me about the dynamism of a port, particularly a modern port in the UK, how that's captured in some of the business case and assessments that you both do.
Yeah, that's a perennial problem, right? It's the same. We design new terminals. How many berths do you need? How often will the ships come? And you can make these amazing optimized berthing window models where the ship comes regularly at noon every day, and it never quite works because the wind blows and the sea has swell. It's building in enough buffer for you to be able to work, but without over designing the facility. I mean, if we were talking about carbon, right? The carbon that's embedded in the concrete and steel you use to build a facility, the environmental destruction you make when you build a port is significant, right? So you don't want to make it oversized. And sometimes engineers like our company, sometimes we may oversize it and over-engineer it so it's robust for every possible variation of ships coming late, which is a lot of extra capex and carbon. I think there is refining and optimizing the way we design ports and the way we operate them to really squeeze those windows. And you see it quite well at container terminals, working with berthing windows, scheduling vessels. That can apply better to bulk vessels as well. Ships racing to give notice of readiness, then anchoring for days, waiting for berth. All that stuff still needs resolving as an industry.
No, it's interesting. And just for those listening, before I come to you, Jake, please do ask questions in the Q&A. We're monitoring those, and Maxine will flag those as well. But I'll come back to those after we've gone through the slides from both Jake and Richard. But Jake, quickly before we come to you, any thoughts on capturing the dynamism in a modern port, particularly in the UK?
Yeah, I agree with Richard's comments. It's part of the life that there's always going to be some kind of uncertainty. I think tools are definitely getting better. We're kind of better mapping, better vessel control to understand where the requirements are going to come in. But from the pure economics of it, you can never fully predict. So it's about building in those safety factors. It's about creating those models, and I'm reluctant to go straight into a buzzword of something called digital twins, but it's because it's not about that. It's about getting the insight to the people who can make the operational decisions. We as per Richard's slides, we put a lot of effort to build in operational efficiency of vessels and other pieces, but actually the operational efficiency of just the timing and arrival and other things can never be understated. So knowledge is the key, and we can never get enough of it.
On the as you touched on earlier, Richard, on the sort of wider business case assessment of some of these schemes, in terms of different fuels, different technologies, there's a challenge, isn't there, Richard, Jake, on increased costs and less security of supply. And what I mean by that is, I'll point to this is absolutely not analogous, but I thought it was an absolutely fascinating story. One of the first stories I read coming back after the Christmas break was the hydrogen bus scheme that had been launched in Manchester a couple of years ago. They've now retrofitted those buses to no longer be hydrogen because they couldn't get the hydrogen and they weren't able to use the buses. And it's absolutely not analogous. But I just think that we have to be slightly careful in all of this, don't we? Is that we increase costs and reduce the ability to get what we need when we need. So just kick that around for a couple of minutes, Richard and Jake, would you?
I think this is energy transition and resilience go together, right? We can
Yeah.
talk about, well, we can buy a ship that runs on methanol, but actually it's really difficult to get methanol. And I think this is a collective challenge. It's not just for the maritime industry either. Aviation's looking the same thing, industry's
Yeah.
looking the same thing. And I think actually that's where shipping will have to compete with some of those customers with deeper pockets, perhaps cities that want hydrogen to run their buses, maybe. And that's going to be quite difficult. I think the order book for shipping has got lots of methanol ready vessels and all the rest of it, but they're not burning methanol today. So supply is the critical thing. I think that, of course, there are practical issues with bunkering and diverse, much more complex mosaic of fuels in ports. And you need, if you're going to use methanol, you need to basically use twice as much as you did marine diesel because it's less energy dense. There are all those challenges, which are practical ones, which I think are all solvable. I think the issue is supply and generation. And we work a lot with clients who live in hot, sunny desert countries who are looking to use large amounts of solar energy to create hydrogen, to then create shipping fuel and export it to Europe or North America. Although many of those schemes are great, but yeah, there's a long lead time before that's really coming through.
It's interesting, Richard, interesting point. And just to add a third leg to the stool of supply and generation, as you touched on. So storage. So in those scenarios, is there a further practical implication about where you store, if there's much more volume that needs to be stored, where it's stored, how much it costs to store, et cetera, et cetera? Is that another element that we need to think about in the supply generation storage side of things?
Definitely. Storage is, and then the risks around that. I mean, ammonia is being promoted as a shipping fuel. I wouldn't want to live in a town that had a large ammonia storage facility in it, to be honest, because of the risk of leaks and poisoning everyone. So there's some practical issues that we haven't been, we're used to diesel and petrol and jet fuel, and there's hazards around that, but there's some new dimensions that need a bit more careful thought, rather like we do with LNG. We treat it a lot more carefully, right?
Yeah. Jake, any thoughts on that? And I promise I'm going to come to you then, I promise.
I mean, just to build on that point, the previous energy transitions that we've had, when we're talking, especially powering the vessels, from sail to coal to oil, all of those had like a improvement in performance, improvement of safety of storage in some ways, and energy density. So this is a real different, because the change here isn't purely economic on this improvement. It's about wider sustainability factors and how we build that in. But economics needs to be a core of it. I always say that there's kind of three drivers for clean maritime on ports and vessels and wider. It's the carrot, which is the economics. You've got the club, which is the regulation that comes in, and you've got the conscience, which depending on where you are can be really powerful or really weak. So conscience is probably a lot behind that hydrogen bus scheme. But of those three, they might kick it off. The economics and the resilience has got to line up.
But I do think we have to get the balance right ultimately between carrot and stick. I don't think stick can always be the answer. In fact, perhaps I shouldn't offer a personal view here. I'm here to compare rather than offer a personal view. But I do think that balance has got to be right ultimately for investors to have confidence that these things can happen. And the other bit I want to touch on just quickly is resilience, because as we touched on there, the ability to get what we need when we need it, to have it at an economic price, is critical, whether you're shipping or a port, whatever it may be. But the wider resilience piece of our ports, particularly in the UK and in mainland Europe, around the military capability and the dual use of major ports in the UK, makes resilience probably more important now than probably what it has been for the last 40 years. So this is the other bit I think we all need to be mindful and cognizant of, is that our ports need to be resilient. That means we need to get what we need when we need it to be able to provide the capability for our customers, and that could be military customers as well as day-to-day cargo. So I think there's an important bit here around resilience.
Yeah, we do a lot of work for the defense customers, and they don't talk about clean maritime in the same sense. It's all about energy resilience. That's the core driving piece. Someone have seen the newspaper headlines this morning, I know some of the maybe not very most reputable source, but talking about how there could be diesel shortages in the future. Everyone needs to jump to electric cars. That trend, if you make the shift in the land domain, that's going to impact supply in the maritime domain as well. So
well, it's interesting, and you'll have both seen this in your efforts around the world. There are ports that have got significant backup diesel generators now, having electrified, have now got auxiliary backup on the basis of cyber attacks, more hostile attacks, bad actors, etc., etc., etc. So I do think this is an area that's going to have growing complexity, and again, something we shouldn't lose sight of, because that will ultimately be part of that carrot stick wider conscience, as you've touched on there. Richard, thank you so much for your slides. I know Maxine is going to share those with colleagues in the audience. Please, for those tuned in and listening and watching, please do put your questions in the Q&A. We'll come to those in about 15 minutes or so. Thank you again, Richard. We'll share those. And Jacob, perhaps I'll hand over to you and you can perhaps take us through your slides.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So just while the slides are loading, I'll just introduce myself quickly. So yeah, Head of Innovation and Research. So that means I portfolio manage all of the research projects we're doing. That's from replanting coral reef in Australia, creating digital twins. Sorry, my life is buzzword bingo. Of oil and gas assets in North America, to helping technology implementation plans in the UK, and vessel design as well. So we do both the ports and the vessel design. So,
but you must tell us about being a futurologist, though, Jake. Surely.
Indeed. So, I mean, the cool part of that innovation and research is not just looking at, what's happening today, but looking into the future and trying to predict those trends and hence build those technology roadmaps so we're ready and at the leading edge. So, my presentation hopefully complements Richard's nicely because it's looking a bit more towards the future.
Can we see our slides? Can I just check the technical capability? Can we see our slides? Yes. Okay. I can't, but you guys can.
I can see. So hopefully
Okay, we'll carry on.
Great. So yeah, first slide. So before we start looking at the future, we need to look at kind of what's immediately on the horizon. What can we see? And a couple of points that we've already picked up on, I think. So we were just talking then about on the need for potentially onshore power generators. So on that left-hand side, people talking about how and we've got a couple of customers who are doing this. They're bringing in energy generation because they can't get the grid connection that they need. But that does create some opportunities. That means that doesn't have to be diesel generators. It can be alternative fuels. It can be HVO, as we discussed before. So looking at wider biofuels. So options there, and that's part of that sustainability journey. Middle case, the middle example I've got there is a really interesting one around ecosystems. So when we talk about sustainability, it's not just about the fuels and the energy and electricity and carbon. It's about wider environmental impact. So yeah, very pleased that we've been supporting a project in Melbourne looking at both floating ecosystems to help biodiversity and using other sites across the port in that way.
Jake, just quickly on, sorry to cut in, Jake, but I'm just interested in your thoughts on this in terms of where we are in the journey. Do you see this accelerating now? I'm not a fan of arbitrary dates, 2030, 2035 necessarily, but do you see this as the whole net zero agenda? Do you see this accelerating? Do you see bumps in the road? Do you see it slowing down? Where do you think we are coming into 2026?
I think, definitely with wider political climate at the moment and trouble in IMO from the vessel side, there's definitely a few roadmaps. But if we take the general view of movement across the piece, we're definitely moving towards it. I think being realistic, especially from the vessel side, we're much closer to 2050 than 2035 dates. But I think there's a real opportunity for ports to be the driving leading edge for it. There's always going to be the chicken and the egg, who's going to go first. But there's a real opportunity for governments who can invest in ports maybe a bit better than they can in the vessel side because they're operating internationally, to be that leading piece and that energy hub. Great. So next slide. So I mean, basically saying exactly what I was just saying there. There's opportunity in the ports because like a port is a node of commerce between whether it's people you're transporting or goods or otherwise. It's it's a kind of a meeting point of all of those demands. And equally on this side, from the energy point of view, you've got that melting point. Maybe there's offshore renewable energy solutions. Maybe there's additional land that can be brought in for wider solar or other usage. And there's potential because there's a huge energy demand. Vessels come in, they need fuel of some kind. How is that fuel going to be created? So potentially with a lot of the we talk a lot around excess energy, especially in the renewable domain, especially on the kind of north coast of Scotland, where you have instances where we've had to turn those wind generation capabilities off so that it doesn't destroy the grid connection. The Orkney and Shetland are good at capturing some of that renewable energy and turning it into other use cases. Can we learn from that and apply that elsewhere? So export that excess energy, create jobs and economic growth. Next slide. This isn't an easy thing. I was joking before we started this session around not just talking about the shiny opportunity, but the challenges in there. And I've called these perceived challenges because some of them are very real. We're talking about economics and infrastructure connectivity, but others, there are things that we can do to mitigate against them. So, technology coming through. I very rarely see that it's the technology that's the issue. Technology is normally 10% of the problem. 20% of the problem is process, and then the rest 70% is around culture and ways of working and how we implement it. And equally, another kind of perceived one around strategy and collaboration. It's great that we've got communities like this discussing today opportunities for collaboration. So is there more we can do to make the most of those? So I won't go into all the details of these. It's more just to say that there are a lot of challenges up there, both from either government side, setting the regulatory, is it working with people or is it counteractive? But economics has got to be the key. Next slide. So possible solutions. I kind of mentioned it in bits, but obviously my pitch is around this kind of port as an energy hub and how that can look in the future. It sounds like great win-win, but there's huge uncertainty around this, and without having that chicken and egg conversation around supply and demand, it's incredibly hard to invest in the infrastructure that might be required for this. So the key enabler that we've seen where we've started to see some movement in this space is about long-term agreements. So if there's long-term agreements with operators that are going to be coming in and they are looking to reduce their emissions, looking to have onshore connectivity for cold ironing, then they're the types of things that are the enablers to make this happen. There's also something around regional growth. So getting wider government buy-in and regional government buy-in to say ports are quite often located in our key city centres. So if we can, as we were saying before, with kind of trust ports, connect to the wider community, connect to the wider city, then that helps with that return on investment type of piece.
Jake, sorry to jump in there as well, but I do think you make a really, really important point there in terms of the regional growth elements. And again, I come at this from my own prejudices, but I do think it is poorly understood more broadly around how important and how large employers and the economic contribution that ports, whether you're trust or local authority or held privately, I do think that is a absolutely fundamental part of how we get to the right place from all of this, because I think there's more, and as we see more devolution across the UK, I think that there's the recognition of often the largest employer or what will go on to be the largest employer in that community in some pretty tough and deprived communities for generations. I think there's a really important point there that sort of the public sector more broadly can better understand.
Indeed. Great. Next slide. So to conclude, I've got some really AI generated images. I know these are like massive extremes, and it's really not that comparative, but I think it's a real opportunity. We've got a couple of customers who are starting to build that strategy. It's not something to switch overnight. It's about understanding the roadmap to get there and aiming for kind of 2040, 2050 timelines. So ports are going to need to be part of that transition, whether it's the city side, it's the port side, or if it's the vessels are going to need that energy through the ports. So it's looking not just at how we operate now, but how we're operating in the future. Huge potential for economic growth and job creation if it's done well. But there's still a lot of uncertainty in the chain. So I think, with vessels, we kind of put on this image that it's all e-fuel powering those vessels. There is not that clarity. In the land domain, it's quite clear electric cars are kind of coming out on top. In the aerospace domain, it's a synthetic fuel that is the sole focus primarily. In the maritime domain, it's a lot more scattered. So that's both risk and an opportunity. Luckily, ports can be very diverse and regional as well. So it's about looking at the operating profile of the vessels coming out of the port and trying to predict what that future requirement would be. And then again, final point I've got around the curtailment of wind energy, but it's really about if we're moving towards a renewable energy future for the UK, then renewable energy is brilliant, but it comes in peaks and troughs. It's not that continuous power load. So is there an opportunity again for that, capture that extra load in the ports as that energy hub?
Thank you, Jake. Really, really interesting set of slides. I'll come back to those in a second. Quite a contrast you paint in those two images, by the way. But I do think it's interesting in terms of as you touch on that clarity. So what do you think needs to happen to get to that clarity? Because I think all of us tuned in as well will recognize some of these challenges. But what do you think, in your view? I'm not asking you to give the absolute fundamental answer to all of this, but what are the steps to get to that clarity? And when you talk about the different types of transition.
Yeah, so I think regulation is a key part of that. I'm not saying that that's the answer for everything, because that sets the demand, because it's, as you said before, it's got to be something that's economic as well. But while there's still a lot of uncertainty around regulation, that still causes uncertainty across the piece. So regulation that maps out a longer term picture so that you can choose the right solution is key. I think it's about building those long-term relationships. Most of the port customers that I work with, they have established relationships with operators, and they are going through the same challenges as well, looking at sustainability. So the more that we can come together, work on something that makes economic sense for both parties and move together on that, the better.
I think one of the, and again, I'll talk in general terms, but the regulatory, as you quite rightly say, I mean, the stick needs to be very carefully handled, and I think that the economics, if I look at some of the schemes that I've been privileged to be part of in the last few years, it's often the schemes it's 5%, 10% more costly. It's often 3, 4, 6 times multiples of cost of investment, and that's very, very difficult to take forward. Perhaps without decommissioning, without the sort of agreement on what's long term in terms of the broader approach. I do think there's a lot of work for us to do to bring those economics together, because ultimately that will dictate, and then the carrot and the stick are about. There's an equilibrium you'd hope you get in terms of that carrot and stick there, but I still think we're still quite a way away from that. That's interesting in what you said in terms of the perceived challenges. Sort of the tech is, I know you're using loose figures to illustrate, but do you feel that optimistic about the technology being 10% of the problem and the rest of it's 70% is culture and all the rest of it? I would probably say it's probably the other way around, to be honest with you. But tell me, I'm interested in your optimism on that, because it's good.
Yeah, I mean, what I find, so we're doing a lot around again, buzzwords, AI implementation at the moment, and that especially is a lot of the technology to do the majority of the solution is there at the moment. So getting the right technology is the 10%. Actually, how that's brought into the ways of working in an effective way, potentially changing some of those ways of working, that's the really hard thing. So I guess it's from my perspective, a lot of the projects that I work on is about implementing technology. So the identification of what the solution could be is about 10%. It's about then making it work. But you're right. If you're looking long-term planning, long-term towards moving to like fully decarbonized, you're right. Technology is a key part of that to keep track of. I think, maybe slightly out of context. It's more
but
about
I think it's interesting. It's an interesting illustration. Richard, coming on this as well, because I think that the other bit, that going back to your point about AI and other things, our port estates, and for those watching, again, we all know, they'll all know their own port estates intimately. But I do think how you implement said technology into said port estate in said economic model, I think is something that still needs to be developed. Richard, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, let's end up with this diversity of the motives of the port operator in making this choice. Have they got the 100-year mandate to improve the port like a trust port, or are they interested in the share dividend in 2 years' time, right? And that can lead you to different decisions and sometimes short-termist approach, to be honest. How do we get around it? I don't know. It's very difficult. This is where policy and firmer government policy to push us towards more firmer deadlines of reaching X and Y by such and such a date, I think will give investors and port operators more confidence in making the investment they need to do.
Yeah.
So then less focused on the short-term horizon, I think.
So Jake, thank you very much for those slides, and I'm just interested in both of your thoughts on when we look globally, where we think this is being done, where we think this is being done well. Jake and Richard, on some of the projects you're seeing around the world, can you think of some good examples around the world?
I mean, I'm slightly biased because we were working on it, but from a kind of like a biodiversity and ecosystem piece, I think Port of Melbourne is a really good use cases. They've got a couple of sites around, and they've, they had issues where they had like a beach right next to the port, and so there was like, a security issue there. So they're like, okay, let's take a strip of land. It's a biodiversity piece. Solve two problems with one piece. So I've got that one from that side. In terms of wider fuels, it's a hard one. I know Richard's in near Rotterdam at the moment. That they're often quite a good, just from their size and necessity, quite a good leader. But there's many others who are finding niche elements to make a movement on this.
Richard, coming on Rotterdam, but also in some of your efforts around the world, if you're seeing governments or agencies that are taking an interesting approach or novel approach. But Richard, tell us about Rotterdam.
Yeah, I mean, Rotterdam is always flagged up as one of the most innovative ports, and they're really tackling these challenges. Even strict laws in the Netherlands about nitrogen and stuff as well. So they're really moving to look at the nitrogen from equipment and things. So they're quite sophisticated. I mean, it's easy to look at them and go, wow, Rotterdam could do it, we could do that too. But they have large amounts of their own money and public money behind them. They can really innovate. And that's great. And that's good for all of us. There's some trickle down of that knowledge. But it's quite difficult to say, well, we can just replicate that in London or Liverpool, right? It is financially quite challenging. Same with Singapore. Large amounts of money going into developments in Singapore. And that trickles down to us. Perhaps they let them... cut the path, if you like, and we follow. I think it's worth a shout out to Portsmouth, to be honest, in the UK. They've done some, despite not being the size of Rotterdam, some really great projects around energy. Really tried some cutting edge things around battery storage and solar, and of course they're closely linked to the city council, of course, there. So they've got that city, people, port, and I think in the UK they're a really great example of port that's leading the way.
That's really interesting. Okay, thank you very much, Jake, for those slides. I know, again, Maxime will share those with colleagues that are watching. And what I was hoping to do, if I can run through some of the questions, I think Jake and Richard, you can also see on the questions. And thanks everyone for feeding in on this. And I'll start with Jason, who asked a question earlier about this electricity consumption, which, as Jake says here, there's potentially multiple of, what's that? That's a multiple of 10, 12 times by 2050. Is that achievable? Is that realistic? Can you extrapolate that across other ports? I think, any thoughts on that, Richard and Jake?
Yeah, I mean that is the scale of the challenge, and I think this is where I'm gonna push it back to you, Geraint, because this is about policy and persuading the government to bring electricity to the port so we can do this thing, and that's a UK Power Networks national grid style challenge, I think.
Yeah, and again, I'll use that as an example to plug Maxine will thank me for this, to plug the UK Ports Conference on the 3rd and 4th of June, because I know that power and grid connection will be a big part of that, as we did in 2025 actually with UKPN and National Grid and NESO. And again, from the major ports group, it's one of our key objectives to make sure that we have a clear strategy there's lots of cooks in the kitchen on this, I should add. But again, I do think that those recognizing ports and airports, actually, the power requirement is going to be very, very significant, particularly through the transition that we've just been touching on there. So perhaps we'll come back to that. I don't think others can see the question. So I was going to take a question from John Hood. Thank you, John. The carbon budget delivery plan projects in 2035, so only 9 years away now, a third of marine fuels will need to be low carbon. Is it feasible? Jake, Richard.
Let Jake go first on this one.
I think, by that statement, if you're going by that statement alone, it depends on what you mean by low carbon. If you're talking about introduction of biofuel percentages, then it's partially already being done across the board. If we're looking at wholesale shifts, we're still not seeing the change in vessel design. It's getting there. Order books for alternative fuels are coming in. Predominantly, that's LNG, because it's seen as like a transfer fuel, because it's not a huge step to convert a LNG fueled vessel to be ammonia or other type of gaseous fuel powered. But considering commercial vessels have lifetime of at least 25 years, I would say it's not necessarily on the ports. We're not seeing the vessels come in and that change in the vessel stock to really drive that requirement come through. So
it's interesting, Jake, and I think that's also a broader challenge in this conundrum, is that the sort of synchronicity of hard infrastructure investment and people making different procurement decisions at different stages in a cycle. I think is again going to be very, very interesting in terms of how we deliver on this as well. And I know John's organisation has some strong views on some of the port projects around the world as well. So thanks for the question, John. Tony Scales has asked, do we think that the UK ports can meet the COP29 target for reducing carbon, and what else can governments do to get them there?
So it's a tough target. I think I'd focus more on what the governments can do, and I think especially in the maritime side, ports is such a real opportunity. When you're counting carbon and carbon credits, yes, vessels, there are opportunities there, but they're operating internationally, and so it's hard to say, well, is the benefit in this region or the country that it's delivering to? Ports, there is no question. The benefit is within the country, and I think we've got an opportunity for UK to be a real, showcase and leading light on there. So, personally, I think that's a great area of investment for the government.
Richard, any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some cool projects going on around like clean maritime demonstrators and stuff. It's a bit more on the shipping side, but it's really good at showing that port-centric decarbonisation is working. I think there's more that could be done from the government. Other countries are moving ahead faster with this because they have more public funding, and we need to perhaps do the same. Of course, that's difficult to do in our complex ownership model, of course, but something like that. I don't know, through VAT or tax rebate or something. I don't know. It's not my area of expertise, but there's more that could be done. And I think once we see ports decarbonise, they act as anchors for the rest of the city as well. If you want low carbon fuel for your buses and the port's using it, then it naturally spreads out from the river or the harbour. So.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just looking at a couple more questions. I'm just mindful of time, but Jagdish asked, with the UK Energy Act and Fuel EU Maritime Act acting as key tailwind drivers, are regulations still in the uncertain territory? And I think we slightly covered off during the discussion, really, aren't we? Because I don't think there's ever a wax seal on these things. They're always slightly open and in the changing and it's sort of touching on the dynamism, I suppose. I think to get to the perfect regulation is going to be a challenge, and we'll always be in that sort of moving
Yeah.
point ultimately, won't we, Jake, Richard?
Yeah, especially when we're talking international, so IMO. I think Fuel EU. I've got a lot of support for that, and it has a few flaws, and there's wherever you have a regulation, people will always try and game the system and design around that to meet that rather than have the actual change. So I think that just it's what I'm trying to get across is that regulation is complex, and although it's easy to have a go at the regulator, I wouldn't want to have their job either.
And this is why I think, and regulations will always be complex, and the regulatory landscape will always be complex. And this is why, and again, this is my personal view, but this is why taking a regulatory approach to forcing something is much more difficult than it often looks. And I think that adding simplicity and taking away complexity is ultimately what we're all looking for. And I think that's the bit that's going to be the bit between how we balance carrot and stick in all of this. So, but interesting question. Thank you for that. And there's also some thoughts on the how we think about the I don't know, ferry operators. So the sort of more mundane day-to-day short sea stuff. How do you see that being part of the wider port picture? Because I think, again, for us as ports, we're thinking about all of our port users, all of our customers, right the way through to military, right the way through to new technologies, right the way through to day-to-day cargo, and ferries going across the Isle of Wight, for example. So tell us about balance and how we get this right between all of our customers.
I think ferries, because they are going back and forth between the same point every day, twice a day, this is the ideal model for building shore power and new fuels. And we see that with the green shipping corridor projects for going from Tyneside to Amsterdam and across the Channel. I think these are the easier wins rather than trying to go for all the ships that go all around the world. We've got to start with something we can control, particularly because these ships also have to bunker and fuel in their territory. They can't sail off to Singapore to get cheap bunker fuel. So I think this is really good, and that's actually where we see the most traction actually happening.
I was going to say, is that moving fast enough? I mean, you're seeing traction in that, Richard, or we can always move quicker, I guess.
Yeah, it's never fast enough, right? I mean, we're in a climate emergency, so faster is good.
Jake?
Yeah, I just echo. I mean, it's on my slide talked about before, the key point was around long-term commitments and being able to bank on those things. So yeah, a ferry is a great example because you know that it's operating between some key points and you know there's going to be that need. It's that long-term commitment that you need to build the rest of the infrastructure.
I think I'd offer one reflection on that, Jake, and I think it's a really important point you make. And this is something we feel very strongly about at the major ports, is as we move through these changes, as we move through policy changes, as we move through the transition, we need to have mutually defined language. So when Jake, you talk about long term, that'll be slightly different to what I think is long term, and it'll be very different to what Richard thinks is long term. And for most people on this call, on this meeting, will probably have a different view of what is long term. What we need to all of us think about is having mutually defined language on certainty, whether that's for an investor perspective, whether that's certainty for the port estate in terms of what we're going to be using these things for, and certainty when we talk about, well, what is long term? And ultimately, the more we can do as governments, agencies, arm's length bodies, you name it, the more we think about mutually defined language, not just using us always using the same words, I think is probably going to help in this journey. And I think it's absolutely essential in that, really. And I think that's the bit that I think has come through today as well, is I think we all want to get there, but I think the more we align on how we get there, the better, really. So I'm mindful of time. So can I thank really, really informative discussion with thank you, Jake and Richard. Thank you for your slides and thank you for taking the time this morning. I know the audience and people attending would have taken some great value from the insights you shared this morning. So thank you very much. I know the team will share a recording of this session. We'll share the slides. So if there are questions afterwards, please go back to the organisers. And for those for joining the call, thanks for taking the time this morning. Jake, Richard, always a pleasure, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.